Hi guys, and welcome to this is Linux for Beginners, I think episode 7, and we have a very special guest, someone who is very versed in the world of Linux and all that sort of stuff. So, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Wendell. I do stuff. I've got a Linux channel. We do content sort of sporadically, not quite as often as this guy. We're getting there, but just sort of random other interesting things. I use Linux on a daily basis, probably more than a daily basis. I've got Linux running on far too many machines. Kind of OS agnostic though. Like I use Windows and Mac OS too, so it's whatever. But Linux is amazing. Linux is the future.
And where can people find you? I'm sure they know, but
You can youtube.com/level1techs, and there's a link to the Linux channel there as well. So we have our main channel, and then we also have a channel that's just for Linux content, because the Linux people can be real touchy about things like off-color humor. So we try to keep all the Linux stuff in one place just for those guys.
awesome. I'll leave links to both the channels in the description down below as well. But so the premise of the video is mostly just for Wendell to give some ideas and give you some sort of tips and things that I suppose he wished he knew when he first started using Linux and that sort of stuff. So hopefully this is some valuable information.
See, you guys got to understand, I've been using Linux since like 1998. So Linux was sort of a different critter in 1998, but it's very similar in a lot of ways. So I don't really remember exactly what I wish I would have known. But I guess the best, from helping a bunch of users on our forum and stuff like that, the best advice that I could give you is, if you're new to Linux or whatever, is to don't use Linux with any expectations. Because if you come to Linux with Windows experience, or you come to Linux with Mac OS experience, Linux is probably going to be disappointing for you. Not because there's anything wrong with Linux, it's just that Linux does things a little differently. There is, if you want to be really critical of Linux, you might say that there is a lot of wasted effort on packages and software for Linux, because the people that want software for Linux are the ones that do the software. And so sometimes not fun things that are part of the software development process, like really trying to design a good user interface, or really trying to, come up with good user documentation, not really part of that process. Now, Linux has been super taking off in the commercial world the last 5 to 10 years. Red Hat is making a ton of money now. And so if you're trying to do commercial stuff with Linux, that's a little bit more true, that you can find documentation and that kind of thing. So if I were to turn that into advice, like what would I advise you, is that a lot of the tutorials and stuff that you would find online are out of date and generally wrong. So if you're like, I don't understand why this is working, I'm pulling my hair out, that's part of the process. Congratulations, you're learning. It's great. Those neurons are forming new connections. It's going to be amazing. Linux will teach you more about the machine and the hardware and that kind of thing. So if you're like, it's like, I'm in a hurry, I don't have time for this, I just want to get from point A to point B, I saw this really neat thing that Linux does, and I don't want to have to think about it, I just want to copy paste commands into the terminal. Linux is maybe not yet ready for you. A lot of the things true, like with Mac OS and Windows, the graphical part of the operating system, the point and click, is pretty much inseparable from the stuff that's running underneath. And so if you want to do stuff, you gotta use the GUI. That's less true on Mac OS, and it's getting to be less true on Windows, because Microsoft is like, damn it, people like using the command line. It's like, well, wait, why is that? Why is Microsoft doing stuff with PowerShell? Well, it turns out the command line is a lot more powerful. And so once you learn to use the command line on any operating system, Windows, Mac OS, if you tried Linux and it was like, oh my God, this is crazy, get familiar with the terminal on Mac OS, or install the Linux subsystem for Windows and get familiar with the terminal in Linux on Windows, because that's a thing. And so you can start there and you can get your toes in the water. And once you're comfortable with the command line, then you can troubleshoot issues like, I can't get into a graphical environment, because if there's problems with your video drivers or whatever, it's just going to dump you to a text terminal. It's like, all right, here you go, fix it. And so, some people on our forums, for example, they'll just reinstall Linux at that point. And it's like, you don't have to do that. It's not quite that drastic. But if you're competent moving around the command line, you'll be able to do so much more in every operating system. Also, we're in Taipei. So Taipei, oh my God.
Yes, thank you to MSI for bringing us out. This is part of the Dragon Squad thing, same as the trip to Austin, Texas, and that was also a lot of fun where I first met Wendell. Yeah, are there any other specific things? So obviously, getting to know the command line, I have actually done a couple of command line basics videos that should hopefully be helpful. And I definitely agree with the everything is outdated. That was, yeah, oh boy.
I want to learn how to do this. And it's like, I mean, even like, so one of the things I love to do is run a virtual machine that gives direct access to hardware for things, so you can play Windows games on Linux on Windows under Linux, which is, not a tongue twister at all. But yeah, all the tutorials, including mine, are out of date on that because there's actually several different ways to do it. Although the documentation for mine works a little better on grumpy hardware, and so like there's a modern way that you can claim PCI Express resources, and my tutorial uses the legacy way, but the modern way doesn't work on every graphics card. If you got an older graphics card, my way is actually better. And so it's like, how can a new user be expected to understand that context? It's crazy. But the thing that most people don't realize is Linux completely underpins Linux and other open source operating systems like FreeBSD. You should also try FreeBSD because that's like, I'm not a BSD hater. It's good. It's all good. The internet infrastructure are running those operating systems. Windows and Mac OS are a joke when it comes to running mission critical infrastructure on the internet, period. That should tell you something about how robust Linux is. Now, is Linux ready for the desktop? No, not really. It's like, is Linux user friendly? Well, Linux is just picky about who its friends are.
So for someone who does have Windows experience or Mac OS, I suppose specifically Windows experience, because I think a lot of the people that watch this sort of content are mostly people who use Windows, play games and that sort of stuff, but also want to go into the world of Linux. For someone who has that sort of experience, I mean, even myself, still kind of a noob to Linux, so with someone with that sort of experience, what are the steps that you would take? What distro would you use? What sort of tutorials would you look at first? Or things that you should learn first before then going into the more detailed stuff? What are the steps that you would take as a Windows user kind of thing?
I think if I were a Windows user and I wanted to non-destructively get into Linux, I probably would install the Linux subsystem for Windows. Probably would use Debian or Ubuntu. OpenSUSE is also available. OpenSUSE is like Brian Lunduk's favorite distribution, which is fine. It's good. It's popular in Europe, and it's popular in business and in the enterprise in Europe. CentOS, which is the community version, kind of, sort of Red Hat, or Fedora or Red Hat are also, well, Fedora really are options for the Windows subsystem on Linux. And start there, because that gives you the command line. There's not really an easy way to run graphical X Windows programs on the Windows subsystem for Linux. But you can get familiar with package management. You can get familiar with monitoring and changing your configuration files. You can get familiar with systemd, which is a pretty much a part of all the other operating systems. If you're really super ambitious, you can also install Arch under the Linux subsystem for Windows. There's a couple steps, because you install another Linux and then you basically do a brain transplant on that version of Linux, and Windows has no idea, so it works anyway, which is cool. Arch Linux is not for noobs, but the documentation on Arch Linux is really good. So if you're a smart person, you will take to Arch really well. And what I mean by smart person is somebody who can read quickly and understand very dense written subject matter. If you need, visual examples or graphical examples, or the concepts are not quite, fully formed in your head yet, Arch is not for you. But Arch is a really interesting distribution, but the Linux subsystem for Windows is definitely the easiest place to start. Up from that, probably VirtualBox. Like run VirtualBox, run a virtual machine on Windows, and then when you're comfortable with that, then you can probably do bare metal hardware.
Another question that I have a little bit with Linux from the viewers that watch the videos is, especially on the gaming side of things, obviously slowly but surely games are becoming a little bit more available for Linux directly rather than through virtual machines or having to dual boot. But for the games that aren't currently available, would you advise trying to go down the route of stuff like IOM you pass through and doing virtual machines with KVM, or would you reckon that just dual booting with it would be considerably easier, and while you don't have the benefit of being able to completely lock it down in terms of Windows and what it does, is that the trade-off probably better for you for someone who is looking to play games but still use Linux as a main operating system?
Well, if you dual boot, you don't have to have two graphics cards. There may be a future that may be close at hand where one graphics card can be shared between host and guest operating system. I was hoping RX Vega would support that, but it apparently does not. I see you, AMD. It is this technology has been available in the enterprise and enterprise graphics cards that are in servers for like forever, but it hasn't made its way to the desktop yet. So dual booting is probably the most pragmatic. If you're comfortable in Linux and you like the Linux philosophy and the Linux ideology and how you are organizing your computational resources with Linux, then IOMMU pass-through may be for you, where you get multiple graphics cards and you give one of the graphics cards to Windows. The Linux graphical subsystem is catching up really fast to Linux. I mean, I can't underscore, like, the graphical subsystem on Linux historically is based on a protocol that was designed for graphical environments for how they were architected in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. I mean, that's a little harsh. There are some people that are immediately pounding the keyboard with their fists to tell me that I'm wrong, but I'm not really. I'm kind of wrong, but I'm not really like. The point was properly conveyed for somebody that doesn't understand the nuances of the situation. So the graphical subsystem on Linux is being completely redone the right way. And like I was saying at the beginning, is like, everybody's going to do it a different way. The people that do Ubuntu decided to do it a different way than everybody else. And so all of those resources were put into their way, which has recently died. And they said, oh, was that wrong? Should we not have done that? And they've given up, not really given up. I mean, the source is there, so somebody else can pick up the project and run with it. But everybody is finally on board with this new way of dealing with the graphic subsystem, which is a modern way to do it. The original graphic subsystem, I mean, Linux is designed like Unix. And Unix is designed to be a multi-user operating system, meaning that it runs on servers and it needs to properly partition and fence off the resources in a single machine for a zillion users. You don't want user A being able to read user B's file. This is a problem when it comes to hardware and drivers and somebody physically sitting at the machine versus a remote user. And so that's one of the reasons that Linux has really lagged behind in the desktop area, is that it was not really designed for desktop use from the beginning, and the people running the show philosophically have problems with giving the local users at the system more rights, more access to hardware, having a way for drivers to do stuff. And so, like, the first thing that had to happen is Linux had to support a lot of really cool stuff in what's called user land. And so we had that, and we've had that forever. But now the ancient graphical system has to be overhauled, and companies are working to do that. But you also end up in lots of weird, impossible situations. Like AMD put in an insane amount of work in their AMD GPU and their AMD GPU Pro drivers for Ubuntu. But the version of Ubuntu that they were targeting was the long-term support version, and they needed stuff from Mesa, which is OpenGL, and the Linux kernel that was not available in that version of the long-term support Linux kernel. So their engineers did the unthinkable. They undertook the Herculean task of backporting, is what it's called, those new features from the new software to the old software. No, only a crazy person would do that. Nobody in their right mind would do that. But it was a pragmatic solution to an impossible problem of, we will support AMD GPUs on a long-term support Linux from day one. So they had no choice but to do this horrible, horrible task. Rather than just tell people, hey, upgrade to the very latest kernel and the very latest Mesa. And that's where all the magic is happening. But I think AMD is sort of learning from those experiences and starting to do really interesting stuff. NVIDIA's binary driver, which means you can't see the source code to it, on Linux is getting to be quite mature for the new graphical subsystem. So we're probably only a year or two away from like really amazing Linux support. And the most impressive thing that I've seen to date is right now today, you can run the Windows version of Doom with Vulkan under Linux natively, meaning there's no Windows. It's through Wine. Wine is not an emulator. See what I did there? And so you can run Doom with Vulkan, the Vulkan APIs, and the APIs are being dynamically rewritten on the fly, basically, to run with Vulkan under Linux. And that is almost performance parity with Windows. So that's why Vulkan is also so important. that most people don't realize for multi-platform gaming, because when this happens, it's like it's inertia. It's a game of inertia, and it's a snowball, and we're going downhill, and the snowball is accelerating. And so it's like, yesterday there was no Doom for Linux that was, the Windows version, and today there is, and then it's just going to be that kind of a snowball from here on out. So it's really exciting times, but that doesn't mean you can't go ahead and learn Linux now. I mean, the OS should not matter how you want to get work done, manage your computational resources, and that kind of thing. That's what you do.
Awesome. So is there any last tips before we close out that you have for any new Linux users, or even I've had quite a few people who do use Linux quite regularly, but maybe it's something that they might be missing in their average day-to-day Linux usage. Is there any tips left?
I don't know about a tip, but I would try to give you comfort and console you. It's like you will eventually get into an impossible situation where you're pulling your hair out. And if you go down the rabbit hole deep enough and you understand the situation that you're in, for me anyway, the anger and the hair pulling sort of evaporates, because it's like, oh, that's why they did it this way. I understand now. It makes sense. Versus, a lot of the time when I'm using Mac OS or Windows, I get into an impossible situation and it's like, why did they do this? Why can't I do anything about this? This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. And I try to go down the rabbit hole of understanding what was going on there, and I can't get there. Like, it's not a thing. So then I end up just sort of packing that anger away beneath the surface. So yeah, Windows, I'm coming for you.
Steam's going to start funneling out of your ears in a minute.
Yeah, it's going to be great. It's going to be great.
Actually, one last thing. For the people, like, when you actually reach that sort of stopping block, I mean, even when trying to install some relatively basic programs, for someone who doesn't necessarily understand the intricacies of the command line yet, what are the sort of resolution steps, the debugging steps you would go through when you're installing a program, for example, and then it comes up with an error? Maybe it's you're missing certain libraries, or it's unable to extract the tar file, or all those sorts of things that do come up quite regularly, especially if you're not kind of set the environment up properly. What are the sort of steps that you would go through first of all to resolve those problems?
Well, it depends on the distribution. All the distributions offer different tools for resolving different types of dependency problems that you might encounter, and also code compiling problems. So mentally, you have to separate things that are handled by the package manager and things where you want to compile source and do stuff from raw source code. So you might go to a package, you might you might find a website of a program that you want to install, and on Windows you download it and you run it and it does stuff. No, don't do that. Try to find that package in a repository for your package manager. Basically, your package manager has sources of packages. And so out of the box, all the distributions have sources of packages that are the people that maintain the distribution. Those are known good packages. And so it is very often the case that you can't find a package that you want in those repositories, meaning that the people that make your distribution, the people that make Ubuntu or Fedora or OpenSUSE or whatever, do not actually... they don't actually check every single package on planet Earth and put it into the repository. But there are usually other repositories that those distributions will recommend that are community maintained. And so upstanding members of the community will package that open source software for something that is appropriate for your system, something that works with the library, something that works with whatever. And all the different distributions have varying degrees of how much work they put into repackaging it. So like Debian, for example, is the distribution on which Ubuntu is based, but it's super conservative, and their developers go over everything with a fine-tooth comb. As a result, Debian typically lags behind on package versions and the very latest versions of things. With Arch, there are a lot of software developers that use Arch Linux, and so it is the complete polar opposite end of the spectrum. Their developers, actually, their package management system is a little bit package management and a little bit source code control. So like with Arch, it's like, I want to install this package, and it's not really part of like the universe of the actual real package managers. You'll actually use Git to just fetch the source code and compile it with a script. And so the stuff that's in their package management thing is not really a package for the software. It's more like a script or an instruction file for going to the raw source and building it, which is really cool, I have to admit. But it's also a slightly more dangerous situation in terms of like third parties maybe being able to take over your system, because it's the onus is on you to vet that package and make sure it's okay. Whereas if you install something from Debian and some of the Debian community repositories, I would be very surprised if there's anything malicious in there. And most distributions fall somewhere in the middle. Something like the Open Broadcaster project, everybody uses Open Broadcaster. Typically you find that in those second and third tier repositories. And it's like, oh, I want to go compile Open Broadcaster from source because of issue X. And so like a common problem, honestly, I think right now, today on Fedora, I think Open Broadcaster has a memory leak, and the package maintainer has not fixed it yet. So if you run Open Broadcaster for more than like an hour or two, it will memory leak and have problems. But you have to experience that and be like, why is Open Broadcaster crashing? I don't understand. And then you sort of search and you go look on the package maintainers. Like there are places where you can go on the internet and see questions people have asked about that, typically GitHub, or some of the Fedora community things, or some of the Ubuntu community forums, and find more information about those kinds of things. So sometimes you can get a bad package from the package maintainer, but being able to troubleshoot that is really a lot of Googling and a lot of looking at the package, and it helps a little bit if you're familiar with software development, compiling code, and those kinds of things.
Awesome. And final thing, just a simple one for the viewers. What's your favorite distro?
I don't know. That's the favorite for what? Right now, I really like Fedora 26 for just desktop use, because it gives me a lot of developer tools, and they don't really do too much. Like there's not really much of a delay when there's an update for something. I can get it. There's a Copper for which is Fedora's like community repo thing, for the very latest kernel versions and the very latest Mesa. So for desktop use, I really like Fedora at the moment. Fedora is also working on a point-and-click GUI for the whole virtualization thing, so that'll be really nice. Arch is not bad, honestly. If you've got some Linux experience and you're comfortable with that kind of thing, it's hard not to like Arch. It really is. Philosophically, I don't agree with some of the things that they're doing in terms of like Linux adoption for the masses, but in terms of it being a good distribution, it really is. It's a good distribution. Ubuntu has just changed some of their policies that I had a problem with historically, the graphical thing, and also they came up with their own desktop. They're switching to GNOME, the GNOME desktop. I think really it's just GNOME and KDE. Those are really the top two environments for new people. Mint with Cinnamon, which is based on Ubuntu, is very similar and sort of user-friendly for Windows people. And so I've been known to give that to like the elderly relatives and things like that. It's like, here you go, good luck. And then, oh, this isn't very different. This is good. So, okay, that's great, whatever. It's all good. So I have, depending on what I'm trying to do, I have different favorite distributions. I like CentOS and Red Hat Enterprise and Debian for servers. I've got one or two OpenSUSE servers, but mostly I stick to Debian and Red Hat Enterprise. But that's, again, commercial use, so...
Well, thank you for joining me. Thank you for the information.
No
Hopefully,
worries.
hopefully, you guys found that useful and informative. Feel free to check out both channels, both the Linux channel and the standard level 1 text channel, in the links in the description down below. Of course, feel free to head over to them. I'll leave a end card subscribe button over this side for Wendell, and of course for myself. And also, I'll leave the rest of the Linux for Beginners series somewhere on the screen as well. And yeah, otherwise, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you all in the next video.